Hola, ¿qué tal?
Hello, good afternoon. We see this venue today crowded. It doesn't surprise me because we have someone here who knows everything or almost everything about a person who is interesting in everything or almost everything for all of us. Ben Rhodes, responsible for national security in Obama's administration. And the order is not important. He was also the writer of most of his speeches, except maybe some of them, like Rajoy would say. Rhodes talks about everything he lived from 2007. And he tells everything about the more than 2,000 days that he spent working in the White House. Now we see his hands, like normal hands, even with a wedding ring. He got married during his time in the White House, and he's had on his hands many of the most important events in the last few years. The intervention in Syria, the Bin Laden crisis. He's one of the few people who've seen pictures of Bin Laden after he was captured, and many other critical times in the Obama administration. I like being here, but we also have to be on Twitter. The word as it is, that's the hashtag for today. We have the password there on the screen. Arqueo 2019. Please be there online. Anything you think that's worth spreading, do it, because we are in a technological environment and we think that it's very interesting that all of you share what you hear Mr. Rhodes talk about today.
Y felicidades por estas...
And congratulations on this 517 pages that are one of the most passionate mandates about the U.S. You've been there on the front line. I don't want to ramble about these introductions too much because it's usually boring for the audience. So I want to address a question for you. You wrote a book, The World as It Is. That's the title. How much did the world change since Obama is not with us?
Well, the world has changed a little bit more than I would like since Obama was president. You know, one of the things that you realize when you're in these jobs, that the story doesn't end even after 8 years where you're in office. Obviously, for me, you know, Obama came into office, you know, I describe at a time of crisis. We had the war in Iraq. We had the global economic crisis, and so we walked into a mess, and we spent a lot of time trying to clean up that mess, to restore the U.S. economy, to bring U.S. troops out of those wars, to deal with issues like climate change that had been ignored. Now my worry is that the next U.S. president is also going to inherit a mess. You know, but the clarifying moment that we're in is, you know, Barack Obama and Donald Trump really do represent two opposite visions for how America should work and how the world should work. Barack Obama stands for an inclusive kind of politics, dialogue between nations, cooperation among nations, coexistence and tolerance between races and ethnic groups. And that's been one part of the American story for a very long time. Trump represents the opposite of that. You know, he represents a politics of division, of blaming other people for the problems in society. And, you know, that has also been a part of American history. And so there's a very clear choice before people. And my hope is that in the coming elections in the United States, that people will reject the Trump brand of politics. So just as we've learned that things can change very quickly from Donald Trump to, from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, that also tells us that things could change back very quickly. And of course, that's what I hope happens.
Cita usted constantemente a Trump.
You constantly mention Trump, and I was saving this question for the end, but do you think that he is not going to get in the White House again? I was saving it for the ending, but you actually gave me the perfect reason to ask this question now.
I obviously didn't think he was going to win in 2016. I didn't think that someone like that could be chosen by Americans in 2016. I thought we'd come farther than that as a country. The reality is that the shift in public opinion in the United States was not nearly as dramatic as the shift in political leadership. Donald Trump got less votes for president in 2016 than Mitt Romney got in 2012 when he was a Republican candidate against Obama. So it wasn't that there was a massive shift towards Trump's view of the world. What Trump was able to do is make Hillary Clinton objectionable to enough Americans that she just got a lot less votes than Obama got, right? So Trump was elected as really an unpopular president relative to most U.S. presidents who were elected. And you've seen him become less popular. And you saw in the congressional elections in November, the Democrats win, and not only win, but the type of people who won, the people who are in the new Congress, they look like a 2008 Barack Obama campaign rally. They are younger, they're more diverse, they're Latina and African American and Asian, and they're more progressive. And I sense in the United States, that type of politics is on the rise. And so to me, if the Democrats don't make a mistake, which we have made in the past, we should win this upcoming election. Trump is less popular than anybody in my lifetime running for re-election. There's a lot of energy among Democrats. But it's tough. It will be difficult to defeat Trump because he will attack whoever he's running against, and he's very good at steering the media in his direction. So I think things should work out for the Democrats in this election, but it's no guarantee.
Alguien que maneja además perfecto.
So for someone who manages social media so well, someone who deals with fake news, actually you talk in the book about how during the first administration they were already facing the fake news that Mr. Trump uses. In the case of Obama, we were saying that he sympathized. They were saying that he was sympathizing with terrorists. Do you deal with these, or you think that you don't have to waste time with these kind of things?
Well, what was very interesting in writing the book is I could kind of relive the growth of social media and Trump, or Trumpism, at the same time. What I describe is in 2008, when Obama ran for president, we had this challenge of people forwarding emails to each other. Somebody's racist uncle writing an email saying that Barack Obama was born in Africa, he was a secret Muslim, and this would be an email forwarded around. And it was enough of a problem that we had to say, and inform our supporters, here's how you reject some of these claims about Obama. And what happened is, because of social media, what used to just be email suddenly becomes Twitter and becomes a Facebook story that is shared. And so these elements of our politics and our society, they were kind of in the background, suddenly are at the forefront. I describe how when I became a target of the Republican Party, I became one of their bad guys, because I was close to Obama. there were always conspiracy theories about us. And, there was this, you may have heard the word Benghazi, that used to be a city. It became a conspiracy theory, basically, in the United States. And I could never tell why this wouldn't go away, and after years, of it not going away, I described I was getting death threats, and the U.S. Secret Service had to kind of patrol my block where I lived with my wife. I started to look on social media to try to understand what was happening, and I found just this enormous volume. I'd go on Twitter, and there'd be thousands of people, attacking me, and it made no sense because, in one theory, I would be a Muslim Brotherhood agent who, was trying to help Islamic extremists in Libya. And in the other theory, I was a part of a Jewish conspiracy to control the media, So these things didn't make any sense. But what I realized is that tens of millions of people were consuming this as their news. That, I, as someone with a communications responsibility, was talking to the New York Times and to CNN. But far more people were actually getting their news from Breitbart and on social media and from Fox News. And a third of Americans kind of lived in an alternative reality where this is all they were reading. That's how you get Donald Trump. Donald Trump is impossible without those changes in our media. People ask, how can people support Trump when he lies all the time? Well, they live in a reality where he's not lying, where it's always somebody else's fault. And so to me, this evolution in how people get their information is what opened the door to these darker forces in our politics. And that's how you end up with a Trump as president.
No quisiera que estuviéramos todo el rato hablando.
I wouldn't like for us to be talking about Trump all the time. I would also like us to talk about Obama. But do you remember in your book a quote that was on the New York Times that said, liberals, us liberals, we had forgotten how important it is, how important identity is for people. We had adopted a message that was not different at all from Imagine by John Lennon, and we had started talking about cosmopolitan capitalism that doesn't reach people anymore. And I think that was almost visionary. Obama wondered maybe people just want to go back to their tribes again. Does that explain the triumph of Donald Trump? This is all these things that are very interesting that we were talking about, Twitter and social media and all this information management.
What's interesting is that Obama himself, he was so charismatic that he could kind of rise above that. All the attacks that came to Hillary Clinton in 2016, all of those attacks came to Obama in 2012. But because of his charisma and his skill as a politician, he could still get reelected. He could still kind of communicate over that bubble. The problem is that for someone like Hillary, it was harder, and for other Democrats, it was harder. I think the important thing to understand on this question of identity also is I think it was inevitable that there would be a reaction against change in the world, not just in the United States, against globalization and against changing economies and against economic inequality and immigration. And then when you have an event like the 2008 economic crisis that takes away people's sense of security in their own lives, that suddenly people feel like they've lost their savings, or they feel like their children are not going to be able to get a job. They feel like life for the next generation might not be as good as it is for our generation. That makes people very vulnerable to appeals based on identity. That when you have these problems in society, it's easy for a demagogue or a far-right political party to come along and say, all these problems are the faults of this group of people. So all the problems are because of immigration in the United States, or all the problems are because Muslims are coming into our country. That kind of appeal based on fear is much more potent in societies that are changing. And when Obama said to me, when he made this comment to me, what if we were wrong and people just want to fall back into their tribe? I think what he meant by that is that progressives, people on the left, like me and like Obama, can sometimes make the mistake of assuming that history is inevitable, that our societies are becoming more inclusive, more tolerant, more equal, and that is the inevitable direction of things. But it's not. History shows that there's always a reaction against that. Every advancement in civil rights and social justice in the United States has always invited some reaction against it. However, if you keep working, you can overcome that. And what I tell people in the United States and what I tell people in Europe is that the Trumps of the world, the Steve Bannons of the world, they want you to give up. They want you to think, there's nothing I can do about this, so it's not even worth voting, it's not even worth trying. And if you give in to that cynicism, they will win. But if you say, no, I reject this, this is not what I stand for, I'm going to vote, I'm going to get involved in public life, then you can defeat these people. And that's the basic question of our time.
Pero ¿observa usted algún paralelo?
But do you see any parallelism with what is going on in Europe, Italy, Austria, even in Spain? You, from the inside of the White House, you didn't see it coming, you didn't see Hillary Clinton's failure coming. So do you think that it's similar?
We saw some of this coming, because what we saw very clearly was the kind of radicalization of the Republican Party. That we saw because we experienced it. And I describe in the book, basically, the Republican Party in the United States went from being a center-right party to being a far-right party over the course of about a decade. If a party, Obama said to me, I remember that, once an entire political party can decide that climate change doesn't exist, they can do anything. Right? Once facts don't matter, you inevitably open the door to conspiracy theory and the forces that led to Trump. So we did see this change because we dealt with this kind of radical obstruction from the Republicans. They wouldn't do anything with Obama. And frankly, some of that, as say in the book, we believed was in part based on race, that there was kind of a rejection of the legitimacy of a black president. And sometimes people will say to me, well, how can you say that? I'll say, well, they said he wasn't born in the United States, he was born in Africa. I don't know how much clearer it can get than that. And so to me, though, so we saw the far-right drift of the Republican Party. We just thought that Hillary could overcome that. So what we failed to just foresee is in an election between Trump and Hillary that he could eke out a victory. I think that it's exactly the same thing that's happening in Europe. I mean, every country has some different circumstances, but the common thread is a kind of politics on the far right that says we need to go back to something that we lost from the past, that we need to unwind and break apart the institutions that bring nations together, whether that's the European Union or other arrangements, that immigrants are to blame for many of the problems that we face. And the message is a little bit different in every country, but there's this common theme. And so, if you look at a guy like Bannon, or, in Germany, the message is about Syrian refugees. In France, the message is about immigrants, but also economic inequality. In Spain, with Vox, it will be about immigrants or separatists. But the common thread is mobilizing people based on fear, telling people that the problems in society are somebody else's fault. And so that there is that common thread that I think cannot be underestimated.
Usted en su libro y Obama se...
So you wrote this book, and Obama used to talk very well about Angela Merkel. You even mentioned that they are friends. Is it possible to establish that kind of alliance between global leaders like them?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so interesting about looking back on the Obama years is that he was in a way swimming against the current. The trend in global politics was increasingly towards this brand of populism and nationalism. And he and Merkel were two of the only leaders that were trying to fight against that trend. And Merkel wasn't perfect, but what she was trying to do and has been trying to do is how do you hold together, the idea of Europe and the European Union in the face of these forces? How do you try to hold together the alliance between the United States and Europe in the face of challenges from Russia and other places? What was interesting is, I tell this anecdote in the book that Obama, towards the end of his presidency, precisely because he could see these trends, started to give speeches in Europe about the European Union, about the idea of Europe. In Brussels and Hanover, Germany, and Estonia, he would talk about, the fact that for all the problems in Europe, don't take for granted 70 years of peace. That's a miracle in the context of history. Don't take for granted for all the economic problems the fact that standards of living are higher in Europe than in any other time and place in human history. That there are huge problems that need to be dealt with, but better to work from within the successes of the European Union, better to address the failures of the European Union without breaking it apart. And what was interesting is that Merkel and Matteo Renzi would say...
Ya la rompemos los europeos solos.
We are already breaking it by ourselves as Europeans, right?
And they would say to him, thank you for giving these speeches, and he would say, well, you need to give these speeches. We need European leaders who are willing to stand up for this. David Cameron admitted to us, he was one of those politicians who for many years, it was easy to blame Brussels. So there's a problem, and you, instead of addressing the problem, you just say, well, I would have fixed that if it weren't for these people in Brussels, right? And that's how you get Brexit. So in other words, it's about the relationships between leaders, but it's also about what the leaders are telling their own people. You need to lead, and you need to stand for something, and you need to offer a bold vision, and that so it's both how do you build cooperation, but also how do you build support in your own countries for these approaches.
Este libro, El Mundo Tal y Como...
This book is very honest. And I told Ben Rhodes before, if there is something about the memoirs of a politician is that he's always going to look good, right? But this book is honest, is cold truth. I think it goes right in the intimate life of the Obama's administration. It talks about feelings, and it portrays Obama, and I wanted to ask Ben Rhodes if he was concerned about, if Obama was concerned about if they were wrong, right? So was that something that was always there in his policies? Was he concerned about being wrong?
Well, I think you separated out. First of all, I wanted to write a book like that, in part because it's more interesting. And I had the experience of being 29 when I went to work for Obama, and I wanted a young person to be able to look at this book and see a familiar experience, right? But also, if politicians want to have credibility with people, or people like me want to have credibility, you can't just say you're right about everything. I mean, most political memoirs are kind of, here's a list of everything I was correct about, all the things that were wrong. If only they'd listened to me, it would have been right. And so, I wanted to show the complexity, and that these are human beings, and that they have doubts. And if people want to feel, one of the problems in societies, people feel distant from leaders and they feel distant from institutions. And I think people are more willing to accept that these are human beings and people making tough decisions. For Obama, there's a question of were we right about what his general project was. And there he never doubted it. In other words, his general political philosophy, that it is better for people to work together, that a nation that is diverse can find strength in that diversity, that nations should try to resolve their differences peacefully. You know, those core values he never questioned. He used to always tell us that we had to think of a North Star. You know, what is the light that we are following? What are the things that we really believe in that guide us in making decisions? On those things, he did not have doubts. But on individual decisions, on any decision, of course you wonder if you're right or wrong. You're responding to crises, or you also realize in politics that almost nothing that you do is going to be perfect. You know, you may decide something that is right, but it's going to anger a lot of people, or it's going to have unintended consequences that you can't foresee. And so I wanted to show people that complexity of what it's like to have to make those types of decisions.
¿Qué hubiera hecho con Venezuela el presidente Obama?
What would Obama have done with it? What would Obama have done with Venezuela?
Well, I mean, first of all, whatever you do, you have to, you know, one of the things I learned from Obama, you need to be aware of history when you make decisions. And one of the reasons why and I described this, you know, I led the negotiations to normalize relations with Cuba. And I did that in part because I wanted to put the very painful and difficult history of American policy in Latin America, I wanted to put that in the past. You know, I thought that if we moved beyond that, we'd be much more able to work with the countries and people in Latin America, and also to be able to help the Cuban people. So when I look at Venezuela today, I'm sure we can all agree, or most of us, that there are enormous problems, and that Nicolás Maduro has made those problems worse. You know, there's too much corruption. He's undermined democratic institutions. However, I think the U.S., because of its history, needs to be aware that when we look like we are trying to select the president of Venezuela, that actually undermines that effort. I actually don't think it's necessarily helpful to Guaido for the United States to say, well, this man is the president. I certainly think it would be a huge mistake to intervene militarily. And again, even if that approach that they're taking somehow manages to dislodge Maduro, you don't want it in the minds of too many Venezuelans and people in Latin America that the U.S. installed this person. You know, that's not a good way to start. So I think Obama, what I'd be advising him, and I think what he'd be doing is, yes, we want to try to restore democratic institutions in Venezuela. We want to address the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And first of all, I think we could be doing far more to help the Venezuelan people. You know, the people who are outside of the country with assistance, the people who are in the United States by giving them, you know, protected status, so they have an immigration status in the United States. But inside of Venezuela, if you really want to break this stalemate where you have Maduro and the military over here and the opposition over here, you have to talk to the different factions in that country. If you want the military to support elections for a new president and to break from Maduro, you have to be talking to the military. Frankly, the Cubans have enormous influence there. You should be talking to the Cubans. And so I think the path that, frankly, the European Union was taking makes much more sense to me, where you try to bring the opposition and the military together. You try to bring our friends in the region into that conversation, but you also have to bring the Cubans into that conversation and try to arrive at some pathway to election so that the Venezuelan people are choosing a new president, not just the United States. That's hard. I don't pretend that that's easy. But again, I worry about the direction of U.S. policy. And I also believe that the sincerity of the policy matters. And you know, Donald Trump doesn't seem to care about democracy anywhere in the globe except in Venezuela and Cuba. And that undermines his credibility when he makes speeches about freedom and democracy for the Venezuelan people, because he doesn't seem to want that for anybody else. And And people know that. People aren't stupid. And so to me, you need more credibility, you need more dialogue, and you need to be mindful of your history.
Bueno, de hecho, Ben Rhodes...
In fact, you say in your book, dialogue is not a reward. So you constantly try to promote dialogue with other countries, always dialogue. Ben Rhodes had responsibility during the Obama's administration. You were writing his speeches, right? I think that is fascinating for anybody. So that's what you were in charge of during the first elections. And when you first met him, so we can focus on you for a bit, because Obama is not here with us, you are with us. So what was your first impression when you got to meet President Obama?
So I was 29 years old, and I had gotten into politics because of the September 11th attacks, and I witnessed those attacks, and suddenly I thought, I want to be involved somehow, and I moved to Washington, and for several years I worked on a commission that investigated the September 11th attacks, and then a commission that studied the Iraq War. And what I learned is that, how much politicians had failed. They'd made the wrong decisions. And so I wanted somebody new. I wanted somebody who'd opposed the war in Iraq. And that's right when Obama was coming along. And so I wanted to work for him. And I describe in the book, I'd begun to do some work for the Obama campaign, but I hadn't yet met Obama. I got called to a meeting where Obama is for the first time. And I walk into this room, and there he is at the head of the table. He's relaxed. He's got his kind of feet up. He clearly very comfortable in his own skin. And he has all these advisors, and they're debating whether or not he should vote for something, a bill in Congress that funds the war in Iraq. And actually, almost everybody was advising him that he should vote for that bill, because if you don't vote for that bill, they said, you will be attacked for not funding the military, even though everybody knew he opposed the war. And I was sitting there, and I was very nervous, because I didn't like to speak in front of other people. That's changed in 10 years. But and so I didn't want to be called on. But Obama has this habit that he calls on every single person in a room. He wants to know what everybody thinks. And so after a while, he looks at me and says, what do you think? And then before I could answer, he says, who are you? And so I was terrified. And I was like, I'm Ben. And because I was so nervous, I decided to ask him questions so that I wouldn't have to talk for a while, and so that he wouldn't hear that I was nervous. And so I said, well, you opposed the war in Iraq, didn't you? And he said, yes, of course. And I said, and you opposed this policy of Bush's? And he said, yes. And I said, and you have a plan that calls for a phased withdrawal of U.S. troops and a shift in responsibility to Iraqis? And he said, yes. And he started to get frustrated with me, like, where are you going with this, And I finally said, well, why would you vote for something that doesn't do what you want and does the opposite? Which seems like an obvious point, but sometimes in politics, that's not how people make decisions. And he said, okay, that's it, let's move on. And he ended up voting against it. And he came up to me and said, thanks, how are you? And I think it demonstrated that Obama and I were both a little frustrated with the unwritten rules of politics. You don't take position, even if you believe certain things, you don't take that position if you might be criticized or if it's not the normal way of doing things. And so to me, from the very beginning, I could see that this was someone who was not afraid of his own beliefs. This was someone who was not afraid of taking positions that were controversial. And this was someone who thought that you needed to change, not just the direction of things, but the way in which politicians made decisions. And that was the beginning of this partnership.
¿Le costó hacerse a su voz?
Was it difficult for you to get used to his voice when you were writing the book? Do you get to do that?
To get his voice was, on the one hand, it's difficult because he's a different person than me with a different life experience. But on the other hand, he had written these very revealing memoirs. Dreams from My Father, his first one in particular. And I spent a long time when I went to work for him reading those books over and over again, reading his interviews. If you're writing a speech for someone, you need to not just write a good speech, you have to write in their voice and reflect their worldview. And the good thing is also he cared about speeches. So, he would talk to me for a long time at the beginning of a speech to give me guidance about what he wanted to say. And he also had a very authentic message. That was his strength as a politician, is that the message never changed. I always tell people the speech he gave in 2004 that launched his career, it's the same message as the farewell address he gave as president. I worked on the Yes We Can speech in that campaign in 2008 that became a music video, and I didn't get any royalties for it, but it obviously did very well. And sometimes people get disappointed, like they're almost upset that a speechwriter worked on that. And I always say to them, well, look, close your eyes and imagine John Kerry giving that speech. It would make no sense. It works because it's Barack Obama's message. It's what he believes. It's his life story. That's the power. It's not just the words on the page. It's the person delivering it. And so, I had to kind of enter into that story that he was telling about himself and about America. And once I did that, it became very easy, because I believed in it.
Sí, pero usted cuenta y confiesa.
Yes, but you always tell and you confess how hard a time you had when you were seeing the speech or heard the speech being pronounced, right? It was even harder than when you were actually writing it.
I loved the process of writing these speeches, and I hated watching them delivered. In part because I was just nervous, and I was always afraid that I had made a mistake. And I actually tell the story in the book about the speech he gave in Berlin to 250,000 people, right, in 2008. So I'd been working on this speech, and I'd never written a speech for that kind of audience. I was 30 years old, and he's about to address this huge crowd in Germany. And 3 hours before the speech, I'm reading it over again, and the big ending that we had written, it culminated with the story of the American pilots during the Cold War dropping food to the people of Berlin in the Berlin airlift. And a story of a German woman, who'd run out in the street and declared, we are a community of fate, which is a nice idea, a community of fate. It was the same message we had in our campaign. We are the ones we are waiting for. And we liked this so much that we took the German word for community of fate. There's actually one word. I don't understand how German works, that there can be one word that means like 9 things. So we put this word in, and so that was going to get all the attention, because it was like Kennedy saying, Ich bin ein Berliner, and Obama was going to say this word. And so I called the German interpreter who was going to be translating the speech so that it could be available in German. And I said, are there any problems with using this word? And he said, yes, I'm glad you asked. This is a theme of Hitler's early speech to the Reichstag. And I thought, oh my God, 3 hours away, I came this close to echoing Hitler in Berlin. This could end the whole campaign, And so I go up to Obama's suite, his hotel room, and he's up there, he's smoking back in those days. And I say, hey, that line you really like in the speech, that apparently is an echo of Hitler. And he looks at me and he says, Hitler, really? And I said, yes. And he kind of held out his hand, like, as if to say, let me think about this for a second. And I was terrified, because, you expect your boss to yell at you or something. And he just collapses in laughter. And he's like, Hitler, are you crazy? But to me, actually, it's an important window in Obama, because if I'd been yelled at, I would have been angry. And then I actually would have been afraid every time I wrote a speech, is he going to be upset? And he could recognize kind of the absurdity in these things. And that, I think, drew us closer. We were in this absurd situation. Neither of us ever thought, we'd be there, him speaking to these people, me working on this speech. But I did have trouble watching the speeches, because I was always worried that I had missed something, and that while he was delivering it, I was going to hear something horrible. And actually, that's what's so strange about watching Trump, because he doesn't care what he says, right? So we put all this effort in fact-checking. And,
Es que lo dice en 140 caracteres, claro.
Well, it's because he says everything in 140 characters, right? So you tell this anecdote and many others in the book, the inner story about the speech when he received a Nobel Prize in Oslo. You also tell the story about the speech in Mandela's funeral. So the book is full of anecdotes, and you tell them perfectly well right here in person, but also in the book they're very well told, and these 500 pages that you read just non-stop. I have many more questions, but I also want to give the floor to the audience. Okay, I'm gonna give you the floor soon, so start thinking about any questions that you may want to ask. And I want to also ask you, Mr. Rhodes, about the Bin Laden, when you captured Bin Laden. Obama was a special person, but how was that moment? How did you do it for those pictures not to be spread? And I want to, well, the publishing house is here, but so don't tell us everything, because you're not going to sell any books otherwise, so please try to be brief.
You know, the interesting thing is that, you know, I was brought into this secret when we were preparing the operation against bin Laden. It's the closest I ever came to actually, like, feeling like I was living in a movie, you know. Because we meet every day, and we were watching this compound where we thought bin Laden was. And, you know, we would review whether or not the people in this compound had been burning their trash as a sign that they were trying to cover up who was there. Or we were counting the number of children who lived there to see if that matched the number of bin Laden's children. And the great uncertainty was that we didn't know if bin Laden was there. We had no firm evidence. We had the number of women and children matched the number of wives and children he had. There, of course, we had intelligence that couriers that were associated with bin Laden were bringing messages there. And we could see a tall person who never left the compound, who paced back and forth. And, you know, we had all kinds of information like this, but we didn't know for sure. And so, you know, the reason it was such a big gamble for Obama was not just that we were flying this team far into Pakistan, but we could be flying all the way into Pakistan and bin Laden's not even there. And I actually had to prepare for that scenario. I had to prepare for all of these different scenarios. You know, what happens if he's not there? What happens if, you know, the helicopters crash? All these things. And the day of the operation, we're there, and you know, the helicopters go in, and actually there's that famous picture of Obama sitting in the room where you could watch this. I was so nervous that I was outside smoking. If I'd known how famous that picture would be, I probably would have stayed in the room you know, like this. But you know, when you hear this news, that, you know, pretty quickly we hear you know, bin Laden's here, and then bin Laden's killed, and nobody else is killed. None of our troops, none of the other people. And we take bin Laden on this helicopter. And I remember going outside and just feeling, you know, like I said, very few things in government go exactly as you plan. And this thing was going perfectly. And I had gotten into politics because of the September 11th attacks. And so I felt this overwhelming sense of wanting to be alone in that moment. And it was a very strange thing also to know something that only like 20 people in the world knew, that you knew billions of people were going to know in a few hours. That was a very strange feeling. And then it becomes a blur, you know, because I had to write this speech to announce this to the world. But you mentioned the pictures of bin Laden. I was very worried as a communications official that there would be conspiracy theories that actually bin Laden wasn't killed, that we had invented this. And, you know, in Pakistan in particular, and in the Middle East, conspiracy theories are very common. And so, you know, we had done everything we could to prove it was bin Laden. We had done DNA tests and facial recognition technology. And, but we had these pictures, and I thought we should release these pictures. And one of the strangest meetings I was ever in government was the next day, the U.S. military put together basically a photo album of all these pictures of the body. And starting, they had gone to the compound, and one of the first reasons they knew it was bin Laden is that all the women started to shout, Sheikh Osama, Sheikh Osama, and then, of course, this looks like bin Laden. And then you see these pictures of the body, and, of course, it's a bit gruesome because he'd been shot. And they documented this all the way from the compound to the helicopter to the base in Afghanistan to the aircraft carrier and ultimately to the essentially release of his body into the ocean. And he'd been given this burial at sea because our experts said if you create a grave, this could become a pilgrimage site for terrorists. And so I wanted to release these pictures to prove that this was bin Laden. And they're also fascinating pictures, kind of very profound, watching this body slowly slip under the water. But Obama said, no, if we release the pictures, we will be, to use an American phrase, spiking the football, that we will be, celebrating the death of another human being, that this could create huge protests and outrage. And he's probably right about that. And the amazing thing is, he makes this decision, I'm very worried. How are we going to deal with these conspiracy theories? And the same day, Al-Qaeda announced that bin Laden had been killed. And so the reason that they were more credible, frankly, in confirming this than I would have been as the U.S. spokesperson. So it in this strange way, always wondered what would happen if they had denied it. But instead, they all confirmed it and said, Sheikh Osama is dead. But it was an amazing experience to live inside of something that is secret and that can go so wrong, and then to have it go well, and then to see that news kind of filter out into the world immediately. Nothing in government was quite like that one event.
Esa angustia de la soledad.
And that anguish, that loneliness of the of you being there helping the president. You talk about that very honestly in the book, and even your brother, who also works in communication, you explain how you have to beat your tongue, right, with things like this. It would have been a great business for your brother, right? But you couldn't tell. You couldn't tell him anything. So we see the parallel life, what you are really living, what you can tell people, what you can't. The book is very interesting, and I want to give the floor to the audience, but I do want to ask you something. How much was Michelle in charge of things in the White House?
Aquí en España, ¿sabe?
Here in Spain, our president's wife, Begoña, she was quite in charge. She ordered for the mattresses in the house to be changed. That was the first decision that they made during the administration.
Michelle was certainly in charge at home. And actually, one of the things is no matter what was happening, Obama had to go home at 6:30 and eat dinner with his family. But Michelle made a conscious choice to not involve herself in policy debates. She had 2 young children. She felt they needed a strong presence. She herself chose her own issues. So her approach was, instead of advising my husband on foreign policy, I'm going to pick issues that will become my areas of focus. So promoting nutrition in the United States, promoting girls' education. She had her own causes. But she was this powerful force, obviously, in her own right. And I think it was very difficult for her, and she writes about this in her book, but to be a very successful woman in her own right, and to kind of give up her career, when it's at its peak, to support her husband's political ambitions, and to raise her children. And we used to joke, I described in the book that I tried to leave the White House at one point, and I went in to see Obama, and I said, I think I'm burned out, I'm tired, I think it's time for me to leave. And he said, you can't leave. And I said, okay, thanks. And so Michelle and I used to have this joke that we were the only two people who weren't allowed to leave. But I think for her, it was a huge challenge to play all of these different roles. You know, she's a mom, she's an advocate, she's a public figure, she's a symbol to black women across America. She's she had to juggle all these roles, and she did it with like an incredible amount of grace. And frankly, you know, she would get very angry, much angrier than Obama, about some of the attacks. You know, Obama was very even-tempered, but what she saw as the racism and the birther thing, some of the attacks came their way, but she also felt that she had to contain, you know, that she couldn't respond to everything. And so I remember when we got on, I was on their last flight on Air Force One after Trump's inauguration. I flew with them out to California, and she gets on the plane, and almost immediately she just kind of collapses on this couch and starts crying. And it's not because she was sad. It was because I think 8 years of just feeling like you're walking on a tightrope, you know, was suddenly over. And to see that burden lifted, you know, it was to realize that for her, in its own way, this was, you know, even more difficult than it was for Barack Obama, because she had to play all these different types of roles.
Vamos a abrir el turno al...
Well, let's finally give the floor to the audience. Did you see Obama crying at any moment?
Yeah, he actually, he cries more than you think. Usually with something involving children. You may remember when there was a shooting of over 20 children in Connecticut. He was crying the whole day. If something hurt children, you know, he would lose his emotions. He used to describe being a father in ways that I think it was very powerful. He said, having a child is like watching your heart walk around outside of your body, which actually really, I think, is a pretty accurate description. And so whenever he saw children suffer, he would think of his own children, and then that's when the tears were.
También cuenta muy bonito cuando cuenta que Mandela.
Yes, that is very beautiful. Mandela also suffered a lot for not being able to see his children, and that was something that was also very touching for President Obama. So you've been there, and we would think that this may be a novel if we didn't know that you're a real person, you're here. Well, I don't know if I should ask a question in English or Spanish.
Vale, yo le quería preguntar por la opinión que tiene.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about your opinion about Bernie Sanders and whether you've created any kind of movement in the Democrat Party in the U.S. For a change of opinion in this respect.
The thing about Bernie Sanders is that he already has changed the Democratic Party. You know, the movement that he built in 2016 wasn't enough to beat Hillary Clinton, but you know, he was able to raise issues and push for an agenda that has helped shape how the party has evolved in the last 2 years. So ideas like what we call Medicare for All, which would be a truly universal healthcare system where everybody pays into the same system. That's now the common position in the Democratic Party. His calls for free tuition for college, you know, that's now a common position in the Democratic Party. So he's already changed the nature of the debate in ways that I think are healthy and also that speak to how change evolves. You know, to me, some people often say, you must be so sad, Trump is trying to take apart your legacy. But I don't, yes, I am sad about that. But I see it a little differently, you know, because if you look at what Obama did on healthcare, you know, he has a plan that dramatically expands coverage. You know, 20 million new Americans are getting healthcare coverage, and it's more affordable for poor people, and you know, you can't be kicked off your insurance plan. Because he took that step, now, you know, Bernie and others can say, well, let's go all the way. to the truly universal plan. And that's how change happens. You know, you take one step, and then somebody comes along and say, let's go farther, right? And that's why I also very much like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You know, Obama did a lot to fight climate change. He invested in new energy. He invested in, you know, more fuel-efficient cars. He regulated, you know, coal plants. And now Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie can say, well, let's have this Green New Deal that transforms the American economy to fight climate change. And so to me, you know, Bernie is a part of the next step. You know, Obama moved the ball this far, and then somebody else has to move the ball farther. And, you know, I think in bringing young people into the political process is what Obama did, and then that's what Bernie did. I think it will be hard for him to, you know, this will be a big field, and he will have to compete against a lot of people. So, you know, and Democrats are always looking for the new face, you know, who's the next savior. But I think Bernie will be a powerful voice in all those debates.
Por aquí.
Hola, muchas gracias.
Hello, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you for advice as a progressive woman, because when I try to understand the current politics, I try to understand why people are voting for Trump. And you say some people do it because they're scared and that they are addressing the emotions of the voters, right? So I want to understand, well, in our case, we are more rational and people are not going to vote, people like us. But in your case, you got people to vote with Obama, right? So, and I remember about those times, and it was very exciting. As a rational person that I am, it was something very touching for me. And so my question for you is, how can we do it now for all those people who weren't voting or who are not voting anymore, to get them to vote, to go back to vote? And, well, Ocasio-Cortez probably, maybe she's also calling for that emotion, and she's also working that way. How can you get progressive people to go back to vote?
First of all, I think what would be best for, you mentioned you're a progressive woman, I think we should, if we could make one change in the world, if you just put women in charge of every country, I think we'd probably solve most of our problems very quickly. They had to vote first, because if you look at the, you know, Trump and Putin and Netanyahu and Duterte and Erdogan and this Bolsonaro, these men who are insecure. Insecure men cause huge problems in the world. But to your question, I think two things are very important. There are two things that really matter. You know, like I said, Trump couldn't grow the Republican vote. Like he got less votes than the previous Republican who lost to Obama. So his strategy was, if I can make Hillary Clinton look no different than me, then I can win. In other words, if I can, you know, people know, I'm speaking as if I'm Trump, you know, people know I lie. But if I can make people believe she's a liar, and everybody lies, then it doesn't matter. People know I'm corrupt. But if I make her look corrupt, then it doesn't matter. And he feeds this idea that all politics is a cynical enterprise. So therefore, it's not even worth voting, right? He can get his voters. But young people, you know, everybody often focuses on these swing voters, you know, are there these people in West Virginia, you know, who voted for Trump, and we must, you understand them. And yes, that's important, but those people never voted for Democrats. You know, the big reason Hillary lost is that young people did not turn out in the same numbers that they did for Obama, because they kind of felt like, well, there's no difference between, you know, everybody's corrupt and everybody lies. And so the first thing is to make clear to people that there is a difference, and this does matter, and there are stakes, and to tell them, you know, Trump's strategy is to make you give up, to make you think that politics is just broken. politics ultimately is a reflection in a democracy of us. And so, if we don't like that things are broken and choose to do nothing, then that's what we're going to get. If you're young and you don't like that politicians are helping to destroy the planet because of climate change, you do nothing to solve that by not voting. And so I think what Obama could, the first thing is make people realize that there really is a choice, and that those choices matter, and that if you give in to cynicism, then things will just get worse. Your cynicism will be validated if you are not active. I think the second thing is you have to make people believe that there are many ways to get involved. Some people say to me, how do I talk to young people about this? And I always say, obviously the most important thing is you have to vote, and that's kind of the first point I was making, that these decisions really matter to your lives, and that the bad people are counting on you to give up. But the second point is that's not the only way you can get involved. You can vote, you can run for office, you can start an organization. If you care about climate change, you can become active on that. If you care about reducing economic inequality, you can get involved in that. If you care about women's rights, you can get involved in that. There are many avenues to enter public life. Obama started as a community organizer, and that sense of organizing, that there may be the young person who isn't sure about whether they care, but if you get another young person to not just vote, but to have that person go around to their friends and organize them and say, this is the only way we're going to make a difference, you then multiply your effect. And so what we did on that 2008 campaign is we sent young people into these states like Iowa, and they went door to door telling people why they cared about Obama. And they brought out other people to vote, right? And so you want people to vote, but you want other people, the people who are already inclined to be involved, to not just vote, but to organize and to get involved in issues, and to get involved in civil society, and to get involved in debates online and in public. Because if government reflects young people, in my view, you'll get better outcomes. In Brexit, young people were against that, but they didn't vote in the same numbers as the old people, and so you get Brexit. And the people who are going to lose are the young people, because now they're the ones who are going to suffer. The old people, they're not going to have to deal with the consequences of leaving the EU. They're not going to be around that long. And climate change is the perfect example of that. Older people aren't going to have to live with, the world irreversibly changing for the worse, right? But if young people don't like that, they have to not just vote, but they have to get involved. And I think we're seeing that more and more in the United States, and it helps to see young people getting elected. The reason someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is important is a young person sees there's someone like me who has a voice. Here's this 29-year-old woman, and she is commanding national attention. And I think that's very empowering to people, right? So part of it is that you get people like that out front, and then other people say, well, I can do this. If she can do it, I can do it.
Una más, bueno.
One more question. Well, a few more questions. I think we have someone there in the back. Try to be brief because they're going to kick us out. Well, we can go later here to a pub and keep talking, but well, thank you for your visit. It's been very interesting. I wanted to take advantage of the honor to be here with persons as relevant as you are, and very important topics like climate change. We are seeing these extremely fast changes in the world. Obama had to deal with the crisis after the Lehman Brothers crisis, and this had an important impact in our economy, and you've been very important in this. So experts in economy back then used to talk about how capitalism had reached a point where we had to change something. It didn't mean that it was going to disappear, but it had to change. And this is very interesting for me. I would like you to tell us your opinion about this, what you were talking about within your team about this topic, the rules of economy, what you used to discuss about back then.
To try to be brief, the immediate goal was to just stop the economy from collapsing, right? So we end up, with $1 trillion stimulus, and a plan to try to stabilize these banks. But then, so that was just to stop the bleeding. The difficult thing is once you put all that effort into just stopping the bleeding, you know, you have less resources to do the other things you want. What we focused on, there are two things. One is how do you create a safety net, right? And so the healthcare plan and some of the other things Obama did were about protecting people. But then the other question fundamentally is how do you restructure economies so that they're fair? And I think the biggest challenge is inequality. You know, for us, at a certain point, we, because of the Republican control of Congress, couldn't pass certain bills. But I think if we could, what we were focused on is if you need young people and older people to be able to get skills for a changing economy, they need to be able to go to community college, you know, vocational college for free. If you need to put people to work, you need to invest in infrastructure, in building roads and bridges and airports. And frankly, we need that in the United States anyway. And if you want to address inequality, you need to change the tax code. You know, you need to significantly tax higher wealth at a higher level, and to have some sense of greater fairness. You know, and so we only kind of got halfway through that project of, you know, first we save the economy, we try to expand the safety net, but once you try to get to things like infrastructure and community college and inequality, we couldn't pass things through Congress. I think if you see the Democrats, they are embracing those plans, and frankly, also beginning to say, we might need things like a guaranteed basic income to deal with the changing economy. We might need a jobs guarantee where the government is helping to find jobs for people. So I think this question of how do you change the nature of capitalism to be fairer and less unequal is going to dominate politics. And frankly, those positions are more popular than the other positions. In our country, I think you'll see that shaping the positions of the Democratic candidates.
Por aquí.
Sí, yo rápidamente.
Yes, just a very quick question. You talked before about how you met President Obama and how he used to ask everybody for an opinion. You feel that your opinion was really considered, that he really took into consideration all your opinions, because at the end of the day, the decision was, he was the one to make the decision.
He did, and the interesting thing he also did is he wanted a mix of advisors. So he always built a team that he knew would give him different points of view. You know, there were people who were older and more experienced and people who were younger and offered new perspectives. You know, there are people who, on a foreign policy issue, might be more inclined to intervene and people who are more cautious. And he kind of wanted to hear the best arguments for every position and every perspective so that then he could make a decision. So you never knew, you know, you never knew if he was completely taking your advice alone. But I think what he was doing is how can I hear all these best cases and then design my own path? And I think that's a useful skill in leadership, to encourage different viewpoints and to not just hear one, but hear many. And frankly, he wanted to test out how good are these arguments, and he would almost interrogate us like a lawyer, you know, and he could expose, if your argument wasn't good, he would expose it. And so he wanted to test how does this argument sound and how can it withstand scrutiny, and then, you know, pick what his decision is.
Por aquí.
Hi, I would like to ask, relating the work that you did as a speechwriter, writing the speeches of one of the best speakers of our history and certainly the best my generation have seen. What career advice would you give a 25-year-old whose dream is to write speeches so powerful, so moving as yours?
Well, it helped to work for Obama. But what I'd say, you know, the most important thing about, and actually that matters, you know, if you can write for someone who you agree with and believe in, you know, the speeches will be better. You know, in life, if you can work for a cause you believe in, or a person you believe in, or even a company you believe in, you will be better at what you're doing. I think the most important advice I give people about speech is a speech has to tell a story. You know, sometimes people write speeches and it's the 5-point plan. You know, it's let me make 5 points about my economic program, every Obama speech was a story. And he would often, deal with an issue and say, what is the history of this issue? How did we get here? And then what is this moment we're in? And what are the choices before us? And then, only then would he say, here's what I'm going to do, and here are my 5 points. And the reason that was so important is that often the history kind of explains why he's going to make the decision. That you give people the context. And so, that idea of telling a story in a speech, I think, is often missed. The other two things I'd say, you have to ask people to do something, too. This gets to your question. Politicians sometimes forget to ask people to do something, to get involved or to care or to change their own behaviors. Or, Obama would always try to involve the audience in what he was calling for, that we can do this together. It's not just me. And then the other thing is he used to tell me everything that we're doing is telling a story about America. Everything. Every speech, every policy, how we carry ourselves adds up to one story about who America is and what we represent. That idea I was saying before about the consistency in the message. Because what people all listen for in politicians is not just the words, but is this person honest? Are they authentic? Do I believe that they believe what they're saying? And Obama had that capacity to come across as authentic and honest. And so if you're writing for someone, try to find things from their own background that show that they understand. That this is why they care. Why are you talking to me about healthcare? Well, let me tell you a story about my own family's history with healthcare. Why do you care about climate change? Well, let me talk to you about my daughters and the world that's coming to them. So personalizing it is also important.
Última pregunta.
Yes, one last question. Yes, congratulations for the book, and also, Sonsoles, congratulations for this excellent presentation. Just very quick, we all have a mass destruction weapon on our cell phones, WhatsApp. We've seen the Bolsonaro conversations. We've seen the regulations about data protection in the US. But aren't you scared of more fake news? How are you going to fight against all this? Thank you.
I think it's like one of the scariest things in the world today. I was just in Myanmar, in Burma, and 10 years ago, there was zero internet in Burma. Zero. And almost overnight, that went to 95% because they suddenly just changed the telecom laws and there's wireless. And so everybody gets a phone because nobody has computers, so they just get a phone. And there's no Google because Google doesn't have Burmese script, so there's just Facebook. And people have no ability no history of being able to evaluate what is true and what is not. Imagine going from having access to no information to having access to what you think is everything. And yet what you're getting on your Facebook page is hate. And I was there and I heard all about these hate campaigns. And if you want to understand what's happened to the Muslim minority community there, this is what's happened, just stirring up of hatred. That's a society with no protections, right? But even in the West, in the United States, 50% of people get their news on Facebook. Now, if you have a newspaper or you have a great journalist like this, Russia can't just create a story and put it in the newspaper, but they can just create a story and put it on Facebook. And people have no idea, no way to evaluate whether that information is credible or not, but they're getting it. And if it validates a point of view that they already hold, then they're going to agree with it. So if you think Hillary Clinton is bad, and suddenly you're getting all these stories about how Hillary Clinton is corrupt, or she's involved in child trafficking, or she's, covering up her own poor health, and you're inclined to believe that, right? And that's what happened in our election. That's what happened with Russia. And what Russia does, by the way, is they find the divisions that already exist in a society. So if they're going to come here and make fake news, it's going to be about, trying to feed the divide between people who support separatism in Catalonia and people who are angry about that. And they just want to increase the division. In France, they want to feed the yellow jackets. And so they pump content in that does this. And there's no guardrail against it. There's no protection against that, right? It's a very powerful phenomenon, a very powerful force. And the other thing to understand is that Facebook's business model is the more people share content, the more money they make, right? So if people are clicking on something, that's good for them. It doesn't matter what that is. And what do people click on? Sensational information. And this is what Trump has recognized. If he says something crazy, that's more likely to get shared everywhere because that's what people share with their friends. They don't share boring, earnest policy reports about climate change. They share stories about Trump saying that immigrants are coming to rape people and kill people, right? So it builds on the divisions in our society. So I think there's no choice. Something that big needs a policy response. And to me, there needs to be some regulation. We don't want to turn ourselves into China where the government is monitoring the entire internet, but you can set some basic standards that people should know whether the information that they're getting is verified and credible. Where does this come from? Frankly, Facebook and all these companies, more than they acknowledge, can tell where it's coming from. And so they can also play a role. Because the essential reality is that they are functioning as a media company. They're giving people news, but they are not regulated, nor do they hold themselves to the standards of a media company, right? And so I think the regulations and the internal practices at all of these technology companies have to ultimately reflect the same standards that we would insist from a newspaper. Because they want to have it both ways. They want to say, we're not a media company, we're just promoting an open internet everywhere. But the way they're making money is by taking content that other people created and sending it around, right? So if you're going to profit off of the distribution of news, then you have some responsibility, I think, to be held to a set of rules and standards. I think the United States will move in that direction, not under Trump, because he benefits from the current reality. But unless we all get a handle on this, the technology is changing our societies faster than we are responding to the changes. And the changes we've seen are towards more division. Since we're ending, I just say I would like to think that's not the inevitable reality of things. I mean, people today can feel very depressed and, oh no, it's, things are horrible. But I think in the long run, people know this. They can sense it. They can sense that there's something wrong. There's something wrong in our politics. There's something wrong with the way in which social media is changing things. I think about, to close on how I think about Barack Obama, my political hero was John F. Kennedy. And because I remember his words, and he had a great time of change. I don't remember even his policies. I remember his words, and they inspired me. And my hope is the impact that Obama had, the words he said. People prefer, and if they're offered that kind of leadership, they choose it. They're just not getting the choice right now. And my hope is that people who are not unhappy with the current state of things, whether it's technology or politics, they stand up and then they offer that kind of leadership. Because I do think there's this sense everywhere that the current moment is worrying and dangerous. And I think we could be back here, hopefully, in 5 years, in a very different moment where we started to catch up and get our arms around these challenges.
Habla bien, escribe bien.
He talks well, he works well. He was here on time. 8:30 we finished, right on the clock. I once again proved that the audience always has the best questions. You are going to find all the answers in this book. And this is better than a TV series because this is the real thing. Thank you, Mr. Rhodes, for being here. And now he will be available for you to sign his book for you if you want. Please don't miss the chance for him to sign your books. This is a must for everybody to have in their shelf at home.